but he did find this as a metal detect find. Those dates, though, came back to 8,500 years when you calibrate it, the median calibrated age today. And then the other one's like 8,000. And this is from northern Wisconsin. And they're solid dates. And I mean, the AMS output, and it's there, everything's on in the paper, you can see. And yeah, so that pushes it back to 8,500 years ago. This is about the same time I am publishing papers using the lake sediments, so showing these like anomalous lead spikes that look just like anthropogenic pollution we see in Europe, in South America, and in Southeast Asia. The same shape, this rapid increase and
Similar onset.
decline.
Are the amplitudes looking similar too, or is it?
Not necessarily. No, not always. There's a lot of interesting things. Some of them are closer to modern levels in the parts of Isle Royale, but it's pretty big. And when there's proper smelting going on, the amount of pollution that comes off that is a lot more than annealing.
All right. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and just let our viewers know like who you are, what your research focuses on, and kind of your path towards this question of ancient American copper use around the Great Lakes.
Okay. So thank you so much for having me on your channel. I've been watching you for a little bit, and I think you're doing exactly what we need to be doing, getting out there, using social media to talk to the public. And so I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about my book, my research, and who I am. So long story short, let's start from I'm born in Erie, Pennsylvania. That's where I was born and raised. So I grew up along the Great Lakes. And this kind of inspired in me a lifelong passion for the earth sciences and the history of the Great Lakes. I fished growing up. I was on the water quite a bit. I swam. The lake influenced our weather on a daily basis. So I got really kind of tied to the Great Lakes region in my childhood.
Like as a sense of place and environment.
Yeah. And you know how you get like an interest in like a certain state or region and you don't know exactly why, but like anything you see about that like place, it's usually where you're born. You just have this like natural inclination to be kind of interested in it. And I was
Yeah.
always like the kid growing up that was like interested in bugs and insects and having different pets. And my mom was always supportive. She would let me get different pets and lizards and things. Um, I grew up right by the shore of Lake Erie, so we would go trout fishing. We could ride our bikes and go fishing even before we had cars, so it gave us a bit of independence. But when we were doing this, I was always exploring the freshwater environment and things like that. So yeah, I kind of was immersed in that as a kid. When I got in my later teen years, I became too cool for school and I was focused on other things. And it wasn't until I went to University of Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I started kind of undecided, but I took a geology class my freshman year. By my sophomore year, I decided to become a geology major. It was like in that geology class that those interests from my childhood that I've kind of suppressed in my later teen years kind of were activated. All that interest in the freshwater environment and all that kind of came forth. I was like, oh, I can actually do an educational path, maybe a career path that aligns with those interests that I've suppressed before. When really, always liked learning. I just didn't like school. I wasn't and when you hear people like professors and they've written a book, you think they were like the valedictorian type person in their high school class. And I was mediocre. I wasn't failing out of school, but I think I just didn't really like school in the format of high school later on. But I always loved learning. Anyway, so University of Pittsburgh, I became a geology major, and that really kind of set the stage for the research for this book.
And that is kind of an elephant in the room that I want to address. You're not actually an archaeologist. You're a
Yes,
geologist who
yes, thank you.
focuses on archaeology. Like the questions that you're interested in are just right up against archaeology.
Yes.
Um,
So I can talk a little bit about that. So I did my bachelor's in geology, finished that up. It was in the, when you're in a program in sciences, you can get involved in professors' research. I was involved with, I got, as a lab assistant in Mark Abbott's research lab, and he takes sediment cores from lakes to reconstruct environments. So a lot of archaeologists are interested in questions you can get from these cores. Traditionally they use pollen to look at vegetation change, that you can look at charcoal. There's a number of proxies. So I was exposed to Abbott's research as an undergrad. And I saw that he had done a study sediment coring these remote lakes. No, I shouldn't say remote, but lakes in the Andes near Incan and Tiwanaku metallurgical sites. But they had full on smelting down there. And this is up to the Spanish contact. So we're talking last 1,000 years.
yeah, they're doing
Uh,
full like
full
alloy
on.
production.
Yes, yes, yes. And so I saw that, and he published that paper in 2003. I'm like in the lab 2007, 8. And I was like, whoa, you could actually like reconstruct the history of economies, like human economies, before we can have records of writing sometimes. And I was like, I immediately, for whatever reason, understood the implications like fast. I was like, okay, so we have like a new window to look at the past, like a new, I don't know exactly, maybe I didn't articulate it. But anyway, I was then simultaneously taking an archaeological class, or intro to archaeology, and they talked about the copper use in Michigan. And I'm like, so Abbott's using sediments to reconstruct pollution in the Andes. And I'm like, did anyone do that in Michigan? Even as an undergrad, I was like, and so I just started like doing some search. I went and talked to him one day in a meeting. He's like, yeah, no one's done it. I'm interested in doing that. That'd be a really good project. I'm like an undergrad thinking, here's like a project of a lifetime. Like what? But that's way too much for just an undergrad. But Mark was like, I was getting closer to graduating. He's like, if you are into that, I'm into that. If you come to grad school with me, we'll find a way you can do TA. We'll work together, and you get your own funding, which I did, and you can pursue that project. And I looked at a few other grad programs, but no one would ever have let me work on reconstructing pollution from copper mining in Michigan. Almost everybody thought it was like a pretty bad idea, except for Mark Abbott. So I'm going to say that right here.
Yeah,
Dr.
to
Mark Abbott was the only one really that took me seriously. And I mean, most people would. I was like 20 years old, or something, 19 or 20, and like in this guy's office telling him this. So yeah, that then led me up to becoming a geologist. So we're studying sediment cores to answer questions typically related to archaeology. So I have never done any archaeology. I mean, I've been in watch people do it. I am a geologist who studies sediment cores to reconstruct past environments and how humans have changed those environments. Yeah. Okay. But I think what else do
that's
that's pretty much it, I think, for the background for me. So that's what led
yeah.
up to this research that led me to being a geologist who studies questions specifically in North America, where there hasn't been, I think, as much work in like using lake sediment cores to reconstruct human activities like there has been in other places, especially South America and Western Europe.
Certainly
So,
not in the same ways. Like you'll see studies looking at like decreases in tree pollens and increases in grass pollens to look at like landscape management from controlled burns out on prairies and that kind of thing. So it certainly is things like that, but not the same kind of like industrial kinds of questions like you've spent at least this portion of your career taking on.
mhm,
Um, and so then yeah, after you did your PhD in Pittsburgh, you were at
mhm.
Kansas for a little bit.
Yeah. So yes. So after I finished my PhD in 2015, and I did, the title was Human Impacts on the Environment Using Lake Sediment Geochemistry in Illinois and Michigan. Roughly, I might have messed that up, but so I
Those are
finished
all the
that degree.
keywords.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are the keywords. And I didn't. I I sought funding for a project similar for a postdoc, but I didn't get a postdoc. Basically, the long story short, didn't get a postdoc in the field of geoarchaeology. And it was difficult to study those questions in North America, especially in the mid, 2010 to 2015. I was working on this. There was almost no work done in North America using lake sediment geochemistry to reconstruct human economies, basically. So anyway, I got a postdoc studying wildfire impacts with Kendra McLaughlin at Kansas State using sediment cores. So very similar kind of methods, but on different questions. Now we're looking at wildfires in Colorado and Montana, and using alpine, subalpine lakes to study that. And so I was there for a few years, but then I ended up teaching there, visiting assistant professor, and kind of, just I went to geology department. I was a lecturer there and like a postdoc. And so that's when I actually was publishing these my old copper culture stuff, because I was just a teacher with kind of like, I was like a free agent. I was teaching and on the side writing. So I was able to just like go and just write all these papers that I thought were interesting for my dissertation. And yeah. And so COVID hit, and I'm a lecturer with no tenure and more or less contract year to year. And so they didn't renew my contract. And then my significant other landed their dream job. And so we moved out here and into Honolulu. That's where I'm currently talking to you from, is Honolulu, Hawaii. And then more or less it was a hiring freeze, and I was just kind of really a free agent at that point and living with here. And then I eventually got hired in geography and environment at University of Hawaii. And now, though, I'm in the natural resources and environmental management department at University of Hawaii. So yeah, it's been a long, winding journey. And for all those who are watching, if you go into academia, be flexible about where you're going to live and what you're going to do, or even in archaeology, because likely you're going to have to be mobile. Some people choose a different path, but they'll get something like government work or something early on. But if you're going to go research in academia, you're going to have to move.
And be willing to like adjust your research focus to accommodate where you're working.
Yeah.
I mean, that's with all field sciences. I think that's part of the toolkit is the flexibility. But yeah, okay, so I want just backing up a little bit, because I'm sure we have very similar experiences of our first exposure to the old copper complex. And so like when I really found it was I was taking a course in southeastern archaeology, and we're talking about Poverty Point, and there's discussion of the copper beads at Poverty Point and how they're probably coming from the copper making cultures up in the Great Lakes. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's copper making cultures in the Great Lakes. What's that about?
Yeah, that's exactly.
And the response was always, yeah, in the Great Lakes, they have copper and they use it sometimes. And that was like the extent of anyone's knowledge on it. No one really knew. And so like, I'm going on archaeology groups on Facebook and just being like, hey, I've heard that this exists. What do I read? Like, and so somebody put me onto Wonderful Power and like read that one. That's for anyone listening, if you like, you need to read that book, because it is an academic quality text, but it's written with the register is very different. It's almost poetic in places. She kind of writes with a certain sense of like majesty and importance to the material that you don't often see archaeological literature written in that kind of um vocabulary, I would say. But great book, really easy read. You kind of fly through it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the fact that these people are, and at that point, at the wonderful power level, we're thinking like 7,000 years ago is kind of the earlier
Yeah, yeah,
extent.
yes,
25 years ago, that was the state of things. Is about 7,000 years old was when people were first starting to use these copper resources to make tools, to
yes,
not just to make jewelry, but it's their entire industrial baseline, with these tools, and also, birch bark and, more perishable things. But
yeah,
you're part of kind of a very small cohort of newer researchers on Old Copper Complex that's pushed it back
hmm,
another 2 to 3,000 years.
yes, yes,
And if you would like to explain that innovation.
yes, yeah, yeah. Um, so just for context, so Wonderful Power was published in 1999 by Dr. Susan Martin, who's at Michigan Tech. So in 1999, radiocarbon dating was just starting to get really, really good. In the 90s, the invention of AMS dating made it possible to date really small bits of material, organic material, to get dates.
I tell my
So,
techs like grain of rice sized is
exact,
sufficient.
yeah, and I've done even smaller than that, and I think gotten better, pretty good dates.
Hmm.
So that changed the game in the 90s. So by 1999, Susan's book, she's summarizing the dates up until that point, and no one kind of systematically looked at them because a bunch came out in the 50s with Willard Libby, and I talk about this in the book, which
Hmm.
this is it. Willard Libby, who invented radiocarbon. He won the Nobel Prize. He did the first date on the old copper culture from Oconto Cemetery. And they still have the letter he wrote. I mean, I think that's how much this story intersects with history.
Hmm.
So those dates came out in the 50s. They're Geiger counter, like shielded dates, missions. So, and then another batch came out from the mine pits in Isle Royal in the 60s and late 50s. Then there's like breaks and some like random dates from other archaeologists here or there, and then a lot of gray literature through the 90s, and gray literature being like unpublished surveys for different things.
It's
um
it's the legal documents typically,
yeah,
like for what we call cultural resource management. Uh, what we produce in that industry are these reports that are known as gray literature that uh basically go to the State Historic Preservation Office. And if you don't know what you're looking for, it's very hard to get your hands on them.
yeah,
And you usually have to have some kind of reason that you would have access to those reports, because they have site locations and we don't want people
yeah,
knowing exactly where to find things to go loot them. So
right,
it's not completely behind closed doors, but it's not super accessible to the
yeah,
average
yeah.
person.
And it's hard to compile it because of that, and as a
Yeah.
researcher from academic standpoint. And so and so Tom Pledger did some good work, and I know there's probably going to there's a lot of good people I'm overlooking. Mark Hill did a lot of good work on the old copper, but it really wasn't until Bukins et al., I believe in the 90s, 1994, they produced the first AMS date, or published it rather, from a piece of wood embedded inside a conical copper spear point, or projectile point of some sort. And the thing to understand for people is copper preserves organic material. When it weathers native copper, it produces oxides and salts, more or less, that preserve organic material like string, fragile string, and wood that you can remove and date. And so they had pieces of wood that were still embedded in these copper conical points. They produced dates around, it was like around 7,000 years old. And so by the time of 1999, that was the oldest, what we called reliable date. There is some older, in the gray literature, Susan Martin had an old date, was organic material associated with or a copper artifact. And so this is a big difference. And I'm glad to communicate this as a geologist to you as an archaeologist. And I went through in my radiocarbon dating paper is there's a difference between an embedded date in the actual artifact and a date that's associated with the same stratigraphic layer. I think there's a lot more error in this stratigraphic association
Sure.
versus at like a literally like it's like you have Otzi the Iceman and you have his axe and you date his axe versus a piece of charcoal found next to him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're like, but when you read the literature, they treat almost those papers from the 2000s and 90s. They kind of talk about the dates more or less like they're all reflective of exactly the time of lost. And
And I think that now that we're doing more Bayesian analyses, statistical analyses, like
mhm,
that's the kind of thing where we would weight those direct dates
yeah,
much more strongly than we would
there we go.
the
Waiting.
stratigraphic.
That's a good way to put it. Weight the importance. And yeah, if you have a lot of stratigraphic dates that are really coalescing on one point and it's matching the embedded date, then you're like, okay, these dates are all like reflective. This is an active cultural layer. It's
Mhm.
pretty good. But yeah, without going too far into that, I don't but so by 1999 and we have 7,000 years. Anyway, I finished my degree in 2015 and I'm giving a talk as the old Copper Culture Conservancy. And I give this talk, and this guy comes up at the end. His name is Bill Reardon. William Reardon is what his author name is. He hands me his paper published in the Wisconsin Archaeologist that I was unaware of. It's not a huge journal. He and his students, he's a retired teacher, they found conical copper points, two, with pieces of wood embedded in. He has pictures. He knows where they are. He tells me he doesn't have the exact locations in the paper, but it's a published paper. It is, I know there's a lot of tension among, and rightly so, and I'm not going to, and we can talk about this later, between avocational archaeologists using metal detectors, disturbing sites. Um, I'll say that Bill Reardon is a retired teacher, and this was part of his class. And but he did find this as a metal detect find. Those dates, though, came back to 8,500 years when you calibrate it, the median calibrated age today. And then the other one's like 8,000. And this
Mhm.
is from northern Wisconsin. And they're solid dates. And I mean, the AMS output, and it's there. Everything's on in the paper you can see. And yeah, so that pushes it back to 8,500 years ago. This is about the same time I am publishing papers using the lake sediments, so showing these like anomalous lead spikes that look just like anthropogenic pollution we see in Europe, in South America, and in Southeast Asia. The same shape, this rapid
Yes,
increase and
similar onset.
decline.
Are the amplitudes looking similar too, or is it?
Um, Not necessarily. No, not always. There's a lot of interesting things. Some of them are closer to modern levels in the parts of Isle Royal, but it's pretty big. And when there's proper smelting going on, the amount of pollution that comes off that is a lot more than annealing, which we
Mhm.
should clarify in the Michigan copper districts and the old copper cultures. There is no evidence for smelting. There is solid evidence for annealing, which is using fire to simply heat the native metal, or the metal that was coming out of the rock was basically more or less pure copper with
Mhm.
mineral impurities and a little bit. And you heat it, it makes it softer. You can pound it. When you pound it, it becomes brittle again and hard to work. So you have to reheat it. You can pound it and it becomes malleable until again, you squish the crystals and you have to reheat it. And you're constantly cooling, reheating. And when you're doing that, even the people that do the reconstructions today, like Larry Furrow, it is an incredibly dirty process, even with that pure copper. They find dust. If you blow your nose, it gets in your nose, it's in your hair, it gets all through your pores on your skin. Every time you're beating it, it's all in your hands. And so you're doing this next to a fire, which is blowing dust in the air. So it's actually a pretty dirty process to work it. Yeah, so anyway, that's so when we're looking at the lake sediment spike, when we were looking at lake sediments recovered from these near these copper mines, we're seeing these spikes. And the date that Bill Reardon comes out with is 8,500 and 8,000 years old. And these match up with the oldest timings that we had found at that point in the lake sediments, because we had observed these lead anomalies that were dated to 8,000, 7,000 years ago, but we didn't have any actual artifact dates from that time. So it was like, whoa, this is just, they look anthropogenic. We don't really have good dates. I still would say we're not well dated back in the early Holocene, but there's definitely enough evidence to say metalworking was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the lake sediments suggest that we can see detectable lead pollution even as early as 9,500 years ago. I know how crazy it sounds, and I have the papers out there. Trust me, I know it sounds crazy, but the earliest you can find it, it's reproducible in multiple sites, is 9,500 years. We see an anomaly in lead, which means way higher than natural variability. There aren't processes that increase toxic lead in the environment besides mainly metalworking and right next to volcanoes that have very weird magma. And so, plants and animals, they don't free up lead and, put it in a form that gets in the lake. So when you see these spikes, there aren't many good explanations besides metalworking. That's why we use it as a proxy lead, is because there's really nothing else that increases it. It stays at really low background levels naturally. Almost in the Michigan lakes, it stays at 1 part per million in all the lakes besides the spikes. So it's just incredible. And if you zoomed into that 1 part per million, you'll see variability, but the variability is like a half a part per million, a part per million. Then you'll see like a 5 part per million increase, and it'll stay there for like 1 or 2 centuries, the same length of our operations, and then it declines. And then it does the same thing. And they are at different times in different lakes, and certain regions only have early spikes. Other regions have middle Holocene spikes. So it wasn't a uniform thing across the region. And that's the same way ores are exploited. You exploit one region, you move to another one. So to wrap that up, this idea, then 1999, Susan Martin, 7,000 years. Bill Reardon, 2015, we're pushing it back 8,500 years. My lake sediment suggests that we can even detect metalworking activity as early as 9,500 years old. And it seems to be in discrete periods. So this is a bunch of separate, well, I call them endemic, meaning they derived or evolved in the area, but at points became really good at metalworking. And then there was like dark ages between them, just like you would think. And then there was another emergence. So it could have been done by multiple groups that might have been, genetically related, but if it happened 1,000 years apart, I mean, think about the difference between today and 1,000 years ago.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
huge. So anyway, I'll leave you take it from here.
Okay, so that makes me want to know 2 things. Are you using like a laser ablation mass spectrometry to do this, or is that like?
So we're using an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, the best instrument for measuring very minuscule amounts of lead, not XRF. For the technical people out there, that would not be accurate enough, precise enough.
It doesn't have the precision that you want. That leads me to the second thing. When I was in about 5 years ago, I was taking an archaeometry class, and under Wes Stoner, he works at Mueller now in Missouri. And we had this XRF, and he just like wanted projects for us to do with it to justify buying it for this class, right? And so I took a bunch of soil samples from a site called Breckenridge Rock Shelter here in Arkansas. And I got, just general stratigraphic from the various stratigraphic levels. I think there were 5. And then I took soil samples from all of the pit features within them. And the biggest thing that stood out was, I forget, I don't, like, this was 5 years ago, I don't remember the specifics, but there were lead spikes in Strat 3 and 2 of the features that were embedded into Strat 3. And I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to go back and look at that stuff now to see what, because this we're talking about Arkansas here. This
Yeah.
is so far from anywhere in the Great Lakes. I was like, and I never had a good explanation for it, only that it was an intense spike in lead in the bulk chemical analysis from the
Yeah.
PXRF, and it was a discrete time period that only involved one stratigraphic layer and two features that were associated with that stratigraphic layer.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
so
I
I
think
was at the
I can speak to that, I think, once you're finished. There's a
uh
good reason probably.
I was thinking at the time that it was Galena because
That's oh, there you got it. You just did it.
yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And there's evidence for using Galena um all through the Mississippi River Valley, Ohio River Valley.
Mhm.
Look up Broxton Bird's study at Avery Lake next to Kincaid. The lead that's going into that lake. Kincaid's a Mississippian culture platform mound, more or less city settlement with it had a palisade wall. The lake right next to it has tons of lead in it from Galena. We can
Okay.
isotopically trace it to that. And it turns out they would crush it. For people that aren't familiar, Galena has a cubic habit. It's a lead sulfide mineral, but it's very metallically lustered. Like it's very shiny. It's very chrome colored. We call it luster though. And when you can crush it easily into more or less glitter powder.
Mm.
So imagine you're doing some kind of ritual with a metallic, glittery, metallic powder, but this is a lead ore. They think they used it in ceremonies, and I think if you add it to fire, it actually might make fire change colors.
Oh, what does it like take it turn it darker red or something like that?
We should double check later, but
Yeah, I
it
can
could
throw
be
it.
someone throwing a handful of Galena powder in there to make the fire change color.
Because
And
like I know guys that have like that'll go to bonfires with like bags of copper oxide and throw it in the fire to make the flames turn green. Like that's a thing
that's the
that
thing.
people do for fun, but like I don't think that people are doing this just because it's fun. Um,
Maybe
but
religiously,
yeah, exactly.
but I think that would be my first go-to if you saw an anomaly in lead and where you are in Arkansas, that is probably Galena.
Yeah.
Some kind of Galena residue or powder.
You missed it at SAA. There was an entire session on Poverty Point, and there were two
Oh,
papers that stuck out. One of them was a Mark Hill paper where he's done another round of laser ablation mass spec sourcing on copper objects from Poverty Point. His like 2015 study was showing that they were mostly coming from somewhere in the Appalachian chain.
yeah.
Um, they they look more like they're coming from the Canadian part of the Appalachian chain, but he also thinks that they look too similar. The Tennessee copper sources and the Canadian copper sources look too similar isotopically to have
Hmm.
really strong separation from. So
Yeah.
he still thinks that they're probably Appalachian sources that just happen to be outliers that are looking more. But this second experiment, he found 6 of the, I think, 9 specimens matched to Minnesota. Um,
Ah.
yeah,
Minnesota copper.
yeah. It's like there's
Yeah.
a small source
Yeah.
that's in a it's like associated with a particular river drainage.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
which that kind of like brings things back to where they were for me like 5 years ago before I read the Mark Hill paper, because it was like, oh, it's all coming from the Great Lakes. Oh,
Yeah.
wait,
Oh,
no,
yeah.
none of it's coming from the Great Lakes. And now it's coming from the Great Lakes again, but it's also coming from somewhere
Yeah.
else. So we've got these multiple points of entry for copper funneling down the Mississippi River drainage and other drainages to
Hmm.
get to Poverty Point.
Yeah. Yeah. And Poverty Point, if I remember right, is dated to something like 3,000 years ago since we're talking
Little older than like
uh,
the
three to
its
four,
end date is about 3,100 years old. Its
which is
start date
younger.
is around 3,700, something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just for comparison to the dates we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. So these are separated by many thousands of years,
Many
but
thousands of years.
it points to the persistence of
Yeah.
copper
Mm-hmm.
in these areas.
Yep. Yep. Definitely. And we can say, for sure, multiple sources of copper and metal ores were used across North America. But one thing that is for sure too is that the copper in the Great Lakes area is by far the largest source of copper. So
Yeah.
like by far, like not even close. And I'm talking native copper.
Yeah.
So it certainly was important, but there is definitely a lot of and I think it varied through time. And I talk about that in the book. I think in the early Archaic, middle Archaic, the Great Lakes copper seemed to be more exploited, and other sources I think became more important later on. But that's just my gut feeling. I think by the late Archaic and Woodland, we're exploiting tons of different ore sources.
Yeah.
But I don't have any data beyond a few thoughts I had about that in the book. But like the shift from utilitarian copper artifacts, there's so many just pure utilitarian artifacts. They're not fancy in any way, and they clearly weren't done just because the pretty luster of copper. They're all like mostly dated to the Archaic period, and by the Woodland period, copper becomes very symbolic, ornamental. It becomes used as headdresses that are like these elaborately pounded, like copper foil, like crowns, we'd call them. And yeah, so to me, that suggests if you're going from lots of utilitarian copper artifacts found literally everywhere, if you go up to the UP, you go to talk to anybody pretty much in that copper area, you go, hey, do you have any copper stuff in your garage? You go, oh yeah, check on this shelf. And I found this over here. And then you're like, there's copper artifacts like falling out of the ground up there. And they're utilitarian. So it seems like there's a lot of copper, and then it becomes harder to get later on.
So at what point do you think that Native American copper miners sailed across the Atlantic and taught the Phoenicians how to use copper and started the Bronze Age? Because obviously that's how that happened, right?
We do joke. That's exactly the joke I've made with other people is, yeah, it's the origin seems to be of metalworking amongst all of humanity seems to be the Keweenaw and Isle Royal. And from there, yes, it spread to the primitive people in Western and the primitive tribes and native peoples of Western Europe and then from there it just spread across Asia.
Yeah.
Like it's the most ridiculous idea. And that's another thing I reached out to you about because I saw that. And I did come across that early on in my research. And I just was like, when steamed ahead because I knew a lot of it was not good. But yeah, that whole this lost copper mining of Europe that came to America, it's unbelievable how little, there's no evidence, but it's so widespread. It's commented. I get emails about it. All the things I associated in my articles, I get comments constantly that we're ignoring this idea that people came from Europe to mine copper.
Because it's a dumb idea.
It's a dumb idea. And another thing is, you're looking at the person who put his like kind of my career on the line to study pollution and lake cores, to study ancient copper. I would be the first person on board to be like, I found evidence of, if I found evidence, I would be the guy that's going to publish it. So no one's against the idea necessarily. It's the coolest idea, maybe coolest idea, but there's no evidence for it.
It would be wild if it wasn't like, if it wasn't so deeply embedded in a 200-year history of archaeology trying to claim that Native Americans were not sophisticated enough to do this thing. when the reality is that, like, what your research is showing is they were some of the first people in the world to systematically exploit metals and learn
Yeah.
how to use them.
And becomes a part of everyday life.
Yeah.
That's the key, I
It's
think.
yeah, no, that it is a fundamental industry at this
Mhm.
point. And of course, Susan Martin talks about this pretty extensively about how it's a very toolstone poor area where this copper is.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So you like it is the natural um substitute for chert, flint, quartz,
Yes.
chipstone technology. And I know that you're aware of like Michelle Beber's work
Yes. I know. Yep.
experimentally showing that, like, yeah, they function almost at the same level. They
Yes.
work pretty similarly. But I can nap a point in 20 minutes. It's so labor intensive to mine this copper and then
Yeah.
turn that copper into usable, tool material. So it makes sense that, once trade networks really start to expand to a certain point, you can trade for toolstone
Yeah.
and use this copper as a status item instead.
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings up the great point of Michelle Beber et al. Refer to this as the techonomic, if I'm saying it right, techonomic devolution
Mm-hmm.
instead of revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And this shift from copper being widely available to just going back to stones. And it's a mystery. That functional efficiency hypothesis she did, and other people, that was really, really interesting. And you're exactly right. It shows no functional difference between a copper knife and a stone knife. I would even argue probably an obsidian knife is way better than a copper knife.
It is, but having made them, they're not durable. Like, they're super
Yeah.
sharp, but they don't
Yeah.
have the durability you want for actual like bushcraft type stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get to is then she looked at projectile points again in this study. And so that is between metal and stone, and there's not much difference there. And what I raise in Great Water, the lost mines of Lake Superior, is that the reason copper was used was in exploited was its malleability, like you're saying, because it makes efficient, highly efficient fishing technology,
Mm-hmm.
hooks, harpoons.
Yeah.
We're next to the greatest freshwater body in the world. When you have good copper hooks, you can exploit fish that are in deep water. So this malleability property, it wasn't the ability to cut, it wasn't the ability to poke, it's the ability to bend. That's what's missing and that I cover. That's what's missing, I believe, in Michelle Beber's work, and I cover in Great Water, is that malleability is the property that was exploited. And that's why they needed it. And that's why it was mined. It wasn't what we're finding are knives because they use those on land.
Yeah.
Copper hooks are also very commonly found, but I bet you if you survey the bottom of those lakes, you're going to find so many copper hooks, so many lost things. I mean, I bet you the majority of it, of this so-called missing copper, which is another myth, the missing copper that went across the Atlantic is not missing. It's lost in prairies, forests, swamps, lakes, Lake
Everyone's
Superior.
granddad's collection.
Yeah, everyone's granddad's backyard in the Keweenaw near Houghton and Hancock. So
I've
it's
covered the
everywhere.
bogus math of the missing copper premise many, many times. It's a mathematical equation where you don't know what A, B, or C equals. So
Yeah,
it's a completely nonsensical claim that
yeah,
I think the Roy Dreer was the first one
yeah,
who, in print that I've been
yes,
able to
yeah.
find, claimed that there's all this missing copper, and he was the one who said it
Dryer
was.
and Dew Temple. Dryer and Dew Temple
Mhm.
is I believe the reference. And so getting back, I do want to talk about this malleability thing because this is the key. So
Yeah, get after it.
in metalworking societies in other places, it's usually associated with more sedentary societies that have agricultural surplus that they use to feed the workers, um, from the people mining to the specialists. in the Great Lakes, with the dates we're finding, this isn't a time that is solidly within the hunter-gatherer time
Oh,
period.
it's 5,000 years before.
Way, and even the contact, there was hardly contact with the French Jesuits. There was hardly any agriculture in those areas around Lake Superior, even in the 1600s.
Yeah.
So there was, even though it was all the way, I don't want to, there is in North America, but so it's solidly under hunter gatherers. How does a metalworking industry develop now? How do we conceptualize social complexity, social complexity arising in this situation? Well, you first need to feed people. And if you don't have agriculture, you are situated by the greatest freshwater body in the world, full of tons of fish and fish that run up rivers that harpoons are great for, and fish that are in deep water, deep water. Lake Superior is very deep. And if you don't have a good hook to go way down, especially in the ice, you're limited to poking with sticks and maybe like a crappy bone hook or something. And when you have the copper malleability to make those hooks, you all of a sudden unlock the greatest freshwater food resource in maybe the world. And now your society has tons of food surplus, but it's dependent on the copper. So now there's a feedback. They need the copper to feed the society with all the fish to support the miners. How do you support miners on a place like Isle Royal?
Yeah.
You need a lot of food. If the majority of the people are up there banging away to get the copper out, someone needs to be cooking something.
Yeah.
It's not just going to be thimbleberries.
There's a whole infrastructure involved with this.
So there's contingent fishing that's supporting the mining operations. I think the copper is critical. This explains why you don't need agriculture. I call it the lacustrine foundations of North American copper metalworking. And I cover it in great water.
I'm gonna like I'm gonna take the image of the cover and it'll be on screen.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So I think we need to address that energy question. The social scientists need to address the energy question.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is like the problem with the energy question is that's like Leslie White and Julian Stewart anthropology from the 1960s, and it's seen as a little passe, but there's a reason to start actually like reintroducing it into the narrative in this particular
case, yes,
because it's such an understudied phenomenon, as you are far more frustratingly aware of than I am. Like I know that this is understudied and I don't even work in it. But this whole like there's a similar situation at the contact period with the Calusa in Florida, where there you're dealing with full-blown like densely stratified inherited wealth and status situations, and they're not farmers.
Yeah.
They are operating on a marine fish resources and weiring and effectively corralling fish as permanent resources. Whereas up in the Great Lakes, even today, like when I was up in the UP last summer, it's smoked whitefish from one side of the peninsula to the other. That's their thing up there. And probably has been for a very long time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and coastal California, upon contact, the people, or I should say coastal Western North America, up through Puget Sound down through California, if I remember right. And I don't know much, but they were dependent on salmon runs.
Yeah.
And so there's another example. They were living adjacent to people corn farming. They never took it up. They were like, we have this salmon. It comes up the river. We dry it. We have tons of food all year. Why do we need to do it? And another interesting case of this is the development and the domestication of cotton in South America was used to make nets for fishing, not to eat the cotton, to fish, to make technology, to make nets. So I think we're
North America, the first domesticated plant in North America seems to be the bottle gourd. So also not for food, as a tool.
As a water container, more or less. Yeah. So that's the thing. This marine fishing foundations of social complexity maybe is an interesting route. And I think
Yeah.
we need to look at that kind of stuff. And this old model of, we have extra barley in the storage that the pharaoh takes care of, and they feed the people with bread and beer, and they work on stuff like that's like late Holocene. That's like late Holocene,
Yeah.
middle Holocene stuff.
It's
We're
much,
talking, yeah.
much earlier. And
Mhm.
one of the other things about this old copper complex thing, I think what it does is when you talk to someone who is tangentially aware of archaeological discourse, right? And they'll try to shoehorn North American cultures into your, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, copper, bronze. They want to try to shoehorn North America into that paradigm, and so they'll start talking about like the woodland period as an American Neolithic. But
Yeah, yeah.
the Neolithic is pre-metallurgical
Hmm.
agriculture. We've
Yeah.
got pre-agricultural metallurgy.
Yes,
It's a
yeah.
complete invert, like the
It's a
way
complete
things
inversion.
worked in the old world, those rules do not apply here.
Yeah.
Indigenous
You nailed
Americans
it.
don't behave the way Europeans want them to
Yeah,
at any
exactly.
time scale.
Yeah. And we just inherit as two guys of European descent. A lot of, we inherit these beliefs that we don't even know about because, or we maybe unconsciously do it. Maybe more people are more conscious than others, but um, we don't have the stories and to actually create that world of the ancient copper miners.
No.
That's what I try to do in the book is, and I bring in the first couple chapters with the guys, the real people, Ralph Turner and Victor Irish, who discovered Osceola, were just two guys fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were so captivated by this thing they found that they started the whole thing that I eventually got to like Libby and everybody.
Yeah.
And but when you got to imagine who they were. They were guys that were out there. They listened to the radio. There was barely TV. The Lone Ranger was important. They grew up in the 30s and 20s. My grandfather told me they would all listen to the Lone Ranger. Tonto was
Mm-hmm.
the Native American guy, and they were fighting like bad Indians in the desert, so the ranchers could have their cows and stuff. And like that's what they knew. They
Yeah.
didn't like, and so when they see this spearhead of copper, they're like, must be the Vikings because like
Yeah.
we don't know anything about that. And so like this communication with the book is why, I tried to make a story so people have a story to tell, to fill in for all those gaps and try to avoid the technicalities to create a real society that's based on the evidence so that we're not like we have some kind of ability to convey that information to someone's emotions too, not just their brain.
Yeah. So actually that's a good segue into actually talking about the book itself.
Mm,
Just for people who hopefully will read it, but those who haven't, you've done a couple of different things here. One is that when talking about the archaeological past, you've kind of novelized it. You've created a narrative around a community that is going to these particular sites and interacting with them in the past.
mhm.
You did a very good job of prefacing this as this is fiction meant to illustrate some of these processes and some of this material that
Yes.
we're finding archaeologically. Don't internalize it too much. Take
Mhm.
it more as um a kind of a way of approaching the archaeological material that's not
Yes.
sterilized of the human element, the actual humanity, which I appreciated that aspect of it. But the other thing that you do is you time hop a lot. You have a
Yeah.
chapter that's set in the archaeological past, and then you jump forward to the two guys on the boat finding the artifacts, and then you jump back to the archaeological past,
Yeah.
and then you jump forward again to some of the researchers who were trying to figure things out. And
Yeah.
it would be very difficult to write this book going, we're going to handle the archaeological past first, and then we're going
Mm,
to do the history part
yeah.
as a separate section. I think it's like it was a good decision to make for the flow of the narrative to,
Yeah.
you know, kind of hop back and forth between, because the whole time I'm reading the historical sections, I'm like, what are the archaeological, what are the turtle people doing? Like
Yeah. Oh,
like,
yeah. Oh my God.
I've got to keep going to get back to the turtle people. What are they about?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It
Yeah.
was, yeah, it's a really cool novel way of exploring this information and getting both sets of information into the same book, right? Not just
Yes.
having a novel about, you know, the archaeological past, and not, you know, just handling the history of the people who were involved. The other cool thing that I liked is that you preserved the screwed up ideas that the various people in the 50s and 60s and the 1800s, like, they're
Yes.
still in there.
Yes.
You didn't take them out. You let the old white guys have a lot of bad old white guy ideas that eventually you're able to deconstruct as you go forward. I think the whole thing is very well conceived, especially for a first like attempt at this style of
Yeah.
um this style of writing, which I haven't. There's been some things by Candy Hollenbach where she wrote a paper with Stephen Carmody that's written as like journal entries from a 10-year-old girl living in Alabama 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That was one paper, and it was published in an academic journal, and 42 people have read it probably.
Yeah.
Um, I like
Yeah.
that this is aimed much more like, this is the kind of book that if I was like in middle school or high school, especially, I would have devoured this thing. It's exactly the kind of thing that I would have wanted to read at the time. And it's
And I
still a good
wrote it
time.
for them. I
Yeah.
wrote it for the high schoolers. I
Yeah.
wrote it for the college students. I wrote it so you can get to see how amazing it is. The real research about ancient copper mining is ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
actually, in the preface of the book I talk about, it's actually more ridiculous than the Vikings showing up.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is more ridiculous. The problem is it comes up against our cultural baggage. We don't have the stories. That's the whole book's about. We don't have the
Yeah.
stories to tell ourselves about what would an ancient society be like in Isle Royal in the Middle Lake Superior 7,000 years ago without making it a cartoon from Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly.
And also you have to have the background of all, is I pulled together all these little lines, like we know flutes and whistles were made with bones. And that really humanizes people. And those bones at Encanto, where Willard Libby found burials, was buried with a young female, was in her mother probably, but it was either way, it was a swan, bone, flute, or whistle. And so I put that in the book because it shows that archaic people were making flutes. You
Yeah.
know, they were making little whistles. They were making maybe calls or calling birds or probably making music. And that really is a human touch, but you just have to read that like in a random article, like, oh, they found a swan bone flute. Like it's so sterile when you read it in the actual archaeological report from the 50s. It's like
Yeah.
one little mention, but I was like, I really hit that. I was like, they're going to have flutes in this.
Yeah.
Because when you hear someone playing music, I mean, today I feel like that resonates with people. Like they feel that person more.
Yeah.
So
So it never got like, in hindsight, now that you have actually you know, written this book, it's like, yeah, why wouldn't, like,
yeah.
like, I can feel the impetus behind it, but like, what was the train of thought? Like, what was happening in like your world that made you decide this is the way I want the book to be, instead
Yeah.
of writing Wonderful Power 2?
Yes. Okay. So first, okay, I want to do a shout out to a quote from my Uncle Joe, who said, if you, every book he likes, he fell in love with the main characters. He just said that to me one day when I was telling him I was writing a book. That's where the fictional plot line came from. I wanted the reader to fall in love with the people and like what they went through paddling across this cold lake, you know, lightning strikes, feeding themselves, you know, they didn't even have plates, you know, they were eating on whatever. And so I wanted people to fall in love with that society. So I took that quote, and that was like kind of the foundation of the fictional. I had read a book that the style of my book is actually called episodic storytelling. So each chapter is like an episode.
Yeah.
And so luckily Americans and most people today have watched a lot of TV, and we love episodic storytelling. We love it instinctively. We don't even know. And we just love those 45-minute stories that hit you with a good thing. And then it leaves it at the end and you could pick up like, and so that's what these, as you said, it's jumping from story to story, but there's connections between the episodes. Like you tune in next week or next chapter to catch up on what happened in that episode. So that was the format. Then I was like, I want to weave that fictional story in so people will love the old copper culture.
Yeah.
But I want them, when they're reading that journey, they're actually on the technical journey at the same time. What were the factual discoveries? How did they come about that informs the fictional story?
Yeah.
So the fictional story is every tiny detail in that fictional story. You may think you're not even seeing a detail. Every tiny detail in there was based on real evidence. But yeah, so from the smallest thing in there, I tried to make it fit with the story, fit with that non-fictional plotline. So that's what got me that in the not being Susan Martin 2.0, because, or Wonderful Power 2.0, because although Susan did an amazing job in that book in 1999, you can't fall in love with any characters in it. You can't fall in love with like somebody that was the person, you know, that actually went out there and did it. And so if we want to get our message, archaeological, geological research, to people that don't think quantitatively, they think in feelings and emotions, that's the most important thing for people. You have to have that ability to love the story.
And I mean, there's like, as two, you know, white academics in this, that kind of storytelling is much, it appeals to an indigenous way of teaching much more. I don't know if you've ever read like anything by Robin Kemmerer. She's famous for braiding sweetgrass. But there's actually kind of a similar vibe to her book that's mostly autobiographical, but in the personal stories she's telling, she's giving you information about botany. She's telling you about how plants work and how people interact with plants and like landscape management and like this dissemination of indigenous knowledge. But it's told through character and story and plot rather than stats. And so that kind of leads me to a little bit of like an uncomfortable place, because as an academic, we are trained to be uncomfortable with our position as, you know, authorities and creators of knowledge and this kind of stuff. I like, it's still a case, and this isn't a criticism, it's just an observation. It's still a case of a white writer writing indigenous characters. So like it's a good first like foray into this genre and this practice. And I've said I think it's awesome. But the next, like there's got to be a next phase where it's, you know, an indigenous writer writing the archaeological past. And I think that's something both of us would like to see. It's just a question of like, I mean, it may be something as like annoyingly cynical as an indigenous, you know, writer reading your book, being mad about it and doing a better job later, which is cool. Like it would be awesome too. I'd love to see that. But we're in kind of this like uncomfortable space when we try to, you know, create indigenous characters and write them from, you know, white 21st century perspectives. Is that something that, I don't know, I might have over talked about that, but like, is that something that like had ever come up with, like that you were thinking about, or is it something that you were concerned with, or was the, you know, mission of making people fall in love with characters kind of outweighing that? Like,
well, you just said it. It was outweighing that. And I'm so glad you brought this up. So I'm glad I sense that you felt that it was a touchy subject, and it is. And I am, Italian, Irish, English, American who grew up next to the Great Lakes. Um, and so I do have an emotional connection to the Great Lakes. I mean, I would say my identity is tied in the Great Lakes, even though I'm a white person. And because of that, the history of the Great Lakes are really important to me. Um, and um, the type of this book is a genre, I would say, and I'm gonna butcher his name. Pekka Hämäläinen from Oxford is a prolific Native American author. He did about the Comanches. He did Indigenous Continent, where he's kind of showing that we need to look at indigenous societies differently, put them at forefront rather than through the lens of colonialism. Actually, what was their story before, like the Comanche Empire is always framed as like Comanches are always framed as like these rogue tribes, like criminal tribes that, the Lone Ranger was hunting with Tonto, when they were actually an empire, probably bigger than Western Europe, organized, the best, horsemen ever in the world. And, we need to focus on that part, the empire, and who were these people rather than a colonial war between cattle ranchers. And so anyway, this is my book is New Indian History is what it's called. I know it's Indian, but that's what they call it. You can look it up. It's and a bunch of other writers are putting Native American stories at the forefront, not just through colonial lens. It is the story. And some of us happen to be white guys. Like Pekka is from, I believe, he's from Scandinavia, Finland, I believe.
His name sounds Finnish.
Yeah, Finnish. And he writes, and the reason I bring that up is I feel like he's in a much better position as a historian. He's addressed, there is that debate has been there since he's been putting his books out. He's been writing about the Comanches, and sometimes people of the descent of those people feel like his interpretation of the archaeological record is wrong. One criticism is, he gives them a lot of agency rather than the Comanches, rather than, down, and in some ways it feels to some people that he's downplaying what happened to them by like making them seem like this powerful empire. And I could be kind of framing it a little bit wrong here, but there's debate there. So it's going to be, the problem is if I want to be able to write books that I'm interested in and subjects, and I'm trying to do it from the standpoint of respect as another thing. And I think other writers like this want to. And so, yeah, we're kind of in this uncomfortable zone. But I hope my purpose of the book is to bring to the forefront Indigenous history. Literally bring it to like high schoolers, and like that's the point of it, is to make it accessible rather than a white guy trying to like put his, diminish it. I'm taking what we know and pulling it out and putting it in the forefront for people. And so,
I mean, and I think it is kind of a, whatever flaws it may have, or may whatever issues people may take with it, it is very much a love letter to the people that lived 6,000 years ago in that area.
That's what I tried. And I recognized also at the end of the book, it leads all the way up to the modern. And I wanted to establish that connection between the modern groups up there. There's still a bunch of tribal land reservations, and their ancestors still live there. They're still there, and they're still doing a lot of the same stuff: fishing, canoeing, wild rice gathering. So anyway.
When I was like about 10 years ago, I was working up in was it Bemidji? No, Cloquet, Minnesota. And there was a reservation right down the road from our hotel, and we used to go, and they do like these community like cookout type things, and like there's an old Ojibwe guy who taught me how to like cook wild rice. And he just like had one of my buddies feeding the fire, and I had the paddle, and he like just spending time together and teaching and like learning and swapping stories and stuff. Those traditions are absolutely being maintained, but
I do, and so this is, I think, if you don't mind, sorry to cut you off. I do want to also bring up the one thing that the connection with the past. There's certainly the groups that are there. The indigenous groups are the ancestors of the old copper miners,
the descendants,
but
yeah.
yeah, sorry, the descendants. But at the time of contact, there was no evidence for proper mining, and this is kind of debated in the academic literature a little bit. And I do think there is an important story to tell here, because it does tell that there is a lot of history in these indigenous societies. There's waxing and waning of societies. They grow, they decline. At periods, there's like dark ages. At other times, it's like enlightenment periods where everything's working. And so there's this feeling that copper mining was happening at a large scale, like right up to contact with the French. And that maybe it was ignored or not, or hidden deliberately from them, even though the French were very interested in the economic resources. That's why they were there. Like if they
Yeah.
knew, they even noted they had copper nuggets. If they saw mining or thought they were hiding it, they would have reported it. But there was no mining. And so there were mines abandoned, though, in the forest. And American prospectors found them starting in 1848. So up until that point, when those were found in 1848, Whittlesley, this is a different era, so there is a lot of racism. But the accounts that are in the mid 19th century, they found these mines and they would go and they'd ask the Ojibwe people, and they were like, these aren't ours. We don't do mining. We have copper. It's a very sacred thing. But even in his early 19th century work, they claim that they had no knowledge of the mines, even though they showed them boulders and other things. So I do think that there was a long dark age of mining lost before contact.
And dark age might not be the best term, but they just weren't doing it.
Or
It wasn't.
economic devolution. They were certainly had copper. Woodland Mississippian societies may have been mining other locations too.
Yeah.
So we got to think we're later. But it seems like the most intensive mining happens early in the Archaic based on the sediment record. So if it did happen up in the last 2,000 years, it happened at a very small scale. That's
Yeah.
my feeling from my work and what I interpret the archaeological record. So they were maybe gathering bits in the stream and float, and they might have traded it, but it seems like the proper mining was restricted to this old copper culture period.
Yeah. And that certainly does add up, especially if your impetus for using copper has shifted from a predominantly utilitarian focus where you just need tons of it to this is a sacred spiritual item.
Yes.
That you don't actually need that. You don't need it in bulk. You need a certain amount of it. But you wouldn't take more than you would need for, whatever social spiritual reasons that you have these things. It's a lot to chew on, especially there was a master's thesis that I read not too long ago talking about the axes, the copper axes. And that's apparently one of the few tool types that did persist after the end of the old copper culture. So it's like the leatherworking tools, the fish hooks, the axes, and not a lot else. Most of the other types kind of go by the wayside at that point.
Yeah.
But then you get all of the beads that are still continuing, and the gorgets and other ornamental ceremonial, the bells, the ceremonial items.
Yeah, like little, like they hammer out little like faces in the Mississippian period, the long nose god, that's his delicate little nose.
Yep.
And in the book I mentioned it as like copper seems to become a rarer material, but the ability to work it seems to increase exponentially. So like they get so much better at making stuff.
I mean,
but it just becomes so much rarer. It's like, again, like opposite of what you'd think.
by the time you get to the Rogan plates, these are like artistic specialists that
like
have these
insane.
skills refined.
Oh yeah, these are like what they make in the memes for ancient aliens. Like, there's no way a human being made this like this bird, like hammered
Yeah,
out of copper. And they're like, well, they have a bunch of them.
yeah.
Someone figured it out, and so but they are. I mean, just so delicate, intricate, specialized copper items of just for decoration and ornaments. So another strange aspect of this whole copper culture, and going back to like this period of absence of copper mining evidence in the Michigan Copper District. Another thing we tell us ourselves, and as people of European descent, is primitive in the past, and it's been getting better and more complex till we get to our ultimate complexity today. And it's like, 2000 years ago, Jesus, even if you're an atheist, and then like ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
and then just like camels and like cavemen. And then it just like, that's how people think. And then they think, okay, if you see complex stuff, it must be in like the last couple centuries, because
Hmm.
like that's when all that's when all the important stuff happens. But in America, North America, it seems like early stuff really was, there's some really advanced evidence for copper metalworking, and then it seems to go away. And then there seems to be periods of like not a lot of activity, and then it seems to be rare, but then complexity goes crazy. And then it's like, it's not as simple as this trotting of time.
It's not this like linear kind of
Yeah.
process, but also the interaction with environments and the way that people are doing things. Um, it may be that the metallurgy goes down, but the ecology is is going up so that they are
Yeah.
able to interact. Like you see a lot of ability to interact with the plant world in such a way that it self-perpetuates, it self-propagates,
Mm.
and creates good environmental. People are creating environmental niches where lots of plant diversity is able to grow, and that attracts a lot of animal diversity to grow. And so you have an environment that is maintained to be abundant, and you don't need quite so much in the realm of these technological developments. It is a uh, it is a rationale that we see in indigenous societies for landscape management that changes their technological needs pretty radically.
Hmm.
Um, it's the the landscape engineering is a kind of advancement that it's very hard for us to see
Mm.
with
Hmm.
the science. Like it's way easier to see lead spikes and say they're
Yeah. Oh
mining
yeah.
copper like crazy. Um, these are uh it's a complicated picture, and it keeps getting
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
complicated the harder we look at it.
Yeah, yeah. I see. So another way of saying that is like a lot of the complexity in technology and advancements, I guess another way to say it, of indigenous North America is just was organic material that's been lost. Like
Yeah.
these manicured landscapes of acorns and chestnuts that like
Hmm.
self-perpetuated are just decimated. And Cahokia, the same thing. And today it's a bunch of mounds, and a lot of the Mississippian sites are, earthen mounds.
Yeah.
So today it's just like, if you don't have a good imagination. But when you go see like Machu Picchu,
Yeah. Well,
or
it's made of rock, and
that's
we're trained to see like, oh, it's made of rock,
yes,
so it's important.
it's important more
Yeah.
because it's in a hard rock and it's carved rock. But Cahokia had all this, wattle and daub structures made of wood that were probably just crazy insane to
And like
look
the
at.
wood
And
palisade, and the one that always
yeah,
blows my mind is the amount of red cedar and the color of
yeah,
red cedar and how vibrant that wood is, and
yes,
the fact that they're using that as building material with such frequency.
yeah.
Um,
And all that's just lost. All that architectural wonder, is another way to put it, of Cahokia is disintegrated. And so yeah, it's easy to see a lead spike. It's easy to see a metal artifact.
yeah,
Those are important to us. But yeah, we're missing a lot of the story.
yeah. What are your like what are the next things for you? What do you have your eye on
Um,
working on?
so right now I'm working on the wildfire history of the Hawaiian Islands,
Okay.
using sediment cores, but to look at questions of like how Polynesian land use has affected fire regimes across the island and introduction of species. So I've been working on that like in a professional capacity here. With the old copper culture research stuff, not much has been planned going on. There's a few ideas, but right now, the field is semi-dormant from the lake sediment standpoint.
Yeah, Michelle said that she wasn't really doing much with copper right now herself either. When I was
Yeah,
talking to her
yeah,
at SAA. So it's
right.
like it's another one of those peaks where we had a couple of people doing stuff about it
And it's
for,
gonna, yeah,
a few years, and it's dipped back down again, and
that's just gonna happen. And
it
it's hard to get funding for this kind of stuff.
yeah.
And so if you're a person watching this and you want to start an endowed chair for old copper mining culture, contact me and we can figure it out how to do it. Because the number one thing we need is funding and public interest in this subject to keep it going.
Yeah.
So it's a, I think that's a reason we're going to see a dip is that the lack of funding. And I've sort of had that issue, but there's other reasons too.
Hmm.
So, but I do hope like if, questions that other people could be interested in that, pathways, I'm more than willing to collaborate or give you people ideas in the public. If you're like, oh, I'd love to do this research. One thing is sedimentary DNA is a very new field. And
Eska.
so there's lots of sediment cores from up there and ancient copper mining societies that live next to them. Could we detect human DNA in sediment cores next to ancient copper mines? That would be crazy. And other things too, like we could look at different proxies like isotopes. And well, another one is a big question of how did climate change during that time. We could study more of to see how that interacted with the copper culture. But the big avenue and another, big finding of the research maybe that I hope to inspire either debate, or agreeance or agreeing with me or disagreeing. But I think one mystery is what happened to the old copper culture?
Yeah.
Why did it go away? We mentioned functional efficiency, and it wasn't that much functionally efficient from the standpoint of projectile points and knives, but it was malleable. That's a very unique property it had compared to bone and lithic technologies. And so it likely was used, that malleability was probably more important than projectile or cutting. So those have been raised as issues as, functional efficiency. It wasn't good enough, so they just stopped using it. I don't think that's the case because of malleability. Climate change could be an issue. I raised that possibility in the book and in previous papers. There is a big drought in the middle Holocene, at least in southern Minnesota. There's evidence at Elk Lake that it almost dried out around
Damn.
5,000 years ago. And so that would have had huge implications for people that are living on lakes, but it still doesn't make that much sense because they don't have agriculture and they're still Lake Superior. So droughts, I just don't think are enough alone maybe to explain it. But I do propose in this book of the diminishing returns hypothesis
Hmm.
that I think, and I've read a ton of, the articles from the 19th century. I think that all the superficial exposures of native copper that were easily accessible to people with their technology, which would essentially been copper chisels and stone hammers, it was more or less all picked over. Our evidence suggests it was 4 to 5,000 years of copper mining intermittently for centuries. These deposits were worked over generations, multiple times. And you find evidence that big masses were just left in the bottoms of some pits because they couldn't get them out. So I think they scoured the area, all the thin veins. We know they mainly exploited thin veins of native copper. There are only so many exposures.
Hmm.
And the rest are covered with soil that's so thick. They even remove soil and a lot of soil, but it can only get so thick. and the rest of it's under the lake water. And so I think they exploited all the easily obtained copper for people with archaic air technology, and it just became too expensive energetically, economically, to exploit copper in the mining form. You still find it, right? You can't be like, oh, we're going to find this many in the stream this summer. So I think this diminishing returns explains why in the middle Holocene, copper mining goes away and never fully reactivates, because it couldn't. It just could not reactivate without revolutionary energy technology, which is in the form of iron drills, which Europeans brought, and dynamite. And fossil fuels to run the machines.
Also, they would need blast furnaces to be able to take the big pieces and actually melt them down and into
actually use them. And so
into workable pieces.
That is why even the first decade or two, first 20 years of copper mining by American miners with European mining experience were unprofitable with iron tools. And so that shows that copper that was out there was still there, but you had to get it out of the rock pretty deep. These pits that they find were like between 10 to 60 feet deep. They're everywhere, even to this day. And I mean, I think sometimes you'll see what I think is an old vein, and it almost looked like a small valley around it. And you're like, what in the heck? And, I'm not exactly sure, some of them are really small, but it almost looks like in some places, many valleys were
they're like wedging out from the side or something.
Yeah, because a vein would have been a vein looks like a parallel plane. They would excavate literally the hardest bedrock next to it, bend the vein back and forth, break it off, probably heat it. There's all kinds of crystals that are forming along these native copper veins too. So there would have been all kinds of crystal and rock, and then they have to push the stuff to the side, then break off the piece of copper or chisel it out, and then reheat it. And I mean, and this is go hundreds of miles. I'm talking acres, and this is not controversial. They went everywhere. They turned over every leaf. There's one native copper vein we know about that's perfectly preserved with no evidence for indigenous mining. It was under the water during the old copper culture. It's on Eagle Island in Isle Royale. It was under the lake water. There's an Nipissing High stand. Is that any evidence to show that the only preserved veins today were underwater during the Archaic, for the people out there in the public to know? And so it was everywhere looked for. And that's why I think it went away. It was too expensive and too hard to obtain. And it just didn't make sense anymore to do it.
I mean, that's a totally tenable hypothesis. I mean, it certainly makes a certain amount of sense.
So I welcome people to challenge me on that, or email me or talk to me about that, because I want to get, especially archaeologists and social scientists, and maybe ways that we could test that or anything like
one
that.
That I would put just as like a first attempt. And the problem is you need dates. You need a lot of dates. And the hobbyist metal detectorists are ripping those pages out of the book and burning them as they read every single day. We need to be able to have a big enough body of dates that we can see the rarefaction curve of the use of copper do this.
Yes. We need dates. And that's money. And that would be that's an excellent project. And the radiocarbon paper was the first beginnings of that. We did 50 of the dates that have been published. But if we can imagine, we had all the funding we wanted, and we communicated properly with the public and academia, and we compiled another 100 or 1,000 dates from the old copper culture. That could be possible.
That's crowdfundable. Like if we were to, and this is something that I'd be willing to work with you on, is and I would be willing to bet that Pete over at Ancient Americas would broadcast this too. If we could get, work with some, collectors who have the conic ones that have, or really anything that has embedded wood that's dateable. crowdfund, starting out 2,000, 3,000 bucks, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Run the dates and then produce a, finished report that all the backers get. Um, maybe have some like backer, updates, Zoom calls where we can talk about, progress, shit like that.
Yeah.
I think that people would be willing to throw money at a project like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just an issue of like, you know, creating the GoFundMe or whatever, getting the
Yeah.
permissions from, various, stakeholders, and actually, getting the work done.
Yeah.
And this is something else that I've been thinking about for about 10 years now, is that people are more interested in things that they have invested in. Um, Being casually interested in this kind of stuff is one thing, but if you've, donated money to a project, you are automatically more invested in the results of that project.
Right.
And like I put up a poll a while ago asking like, if we did some kind of a crowdfunding research project, would you be interested in that? And 95% of people out of I think it was like 120 said, yeah, like let's do it.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of like finding the project. And this might be one such project.
Yeah, yeah. We did attempt this a little bit with a core project with Michigan Tech, and we did get some money. But I think it'd be a great idea. I mean, in like an open donation period for me, even maybe even like, a few years, so people that hear about the project can like add money to
We
it or
just like
something
do it
like.
in rounds. We'd do it in
Yeah.
like batches, basically.
Yeah, and making sure we're getting good dates also with provenance, because a lot of these
Yeah.
metal detectorists, and by the way, if it's on their private land, I just also want to clarify this for young people out there
Yeah.
who, if it's on your private land in Wisconsin and Michigan, and it's not a human remain, and you metal detect it, it's technically legal to take, as long as the landowner is fine with it. I'm not saying and we have to understand archaeology, all artifacts, the context is really important. But if you are a metal detectorist and you're on private land and you're doing everything legally and there's no human remains nearby, if you get a copper conical point with wood in it, get the Latin long of where you found that and write it down, email it to yourself. Take the notes an archaeologist would take all the context, preserve everything. Don't wash anything, and contact people that know what they're doing, and you'll be able to contribute to science, like real science, and instead of just, I hate to say it, like stealing artifacts,
Yeah.
but
And like
but
all that being said, like, yes, it's legal. It's still not preferable. Like
yeah, not preferable.
some of this stuff is already out of the ground. There's nothing we can do about it. All we can do
Yeah,
is salvage what little data that can be salvaged.
yeah,
But my friends and colleagues within the indigenous community do consider that kind of collecting to be a slap in their face.
yeah,
That people
yeah,
are continuing to treat the material products of their ancestors as trophies to be put on a mantle.
yeah, yeah,
They still consider it a very dehumanizing practice. So I do want to discourage it, but if it's
yeah,
already out of the ground and you
yeah,
already know at least a county, Randy
yeah,
Daniel has done some great like county level resolution analysis of Paleolithic projectile points that's
yeah,
actually been fairly productive. If we know what county the artifact came from,
yeah,
that's enough to build
yes,
if we get a big enough data set, that's enough to build a research design around.
right, right,
We can salvage information from those things where all the other information has been lost. Um,
right. Yeah, and some of these artifacts are just totally, eroding out of a stream bank, or, building a shed and you found it, and
yeah,
so they're already almost out of context is a different thing. Yeah, but ideally, we shouldn't be digging up artifacts unless you are an archaeologist. That is
And
definitely
we
the
like something I've talked about a lot before, but like we don't even dig up artifacts unless there is some imminent destruction. Typically, if there's a
Mhm.
highway going through, or a oil and gas pipeline, or a solar farm, or something that's going to cause damage in the
Yeah,
immediate future anyway, we don't
yeah,
typically
exactly,
do any digging
exactly.
ourselves. Um,
Yeah. And so, and also as part, just to take, balance the conversation out, we are here to publicly communicate.
yeah,
And that's why I think it's infinitely worse that someone metal detects and they don't record the lat and long, and then someone throws out that artifact without anybody ever knowing anything about it. And we can't, the metal detectors are in the public and people are doing it, and it's not ideal. And so if you are doing it, like, make sure you're doing it as much as of a scientific way as possible.
yeah,
And that way perhaps something can come out of this, and maybe you'll even learn that how important it is not to do not to just take artifacts that are out of context, or you're actually digging them out of the ground rather
yeah.
than they're like falling out of the stream bank. But so I want to engage with people doing that in a productive way, at the same time teaching them that about the process behind science. And so for those out there, I'm not going to scare you away if you talk to me, if I find out you metal detected something, but I will
No
make
one's
sure.
calling the cops.
Yeah, I will ask if you wrote the Latin long down, and I will tell you to preserve it, and I will tell you to, treat it with respect. So we want to encourage curiosity too in the public, and the book is, how do we get the public to want to crowdfund something about the ancient copper mines? Well, we need a book like Great Water to help to help
We
people
need people to
fall in love
actually
with it,
care. We
to
need people
actually
to know it
care,
exists and to care.
to know that and care. They need to know, like, holy crap, America's history is older than the old world. And
In
the
certain respects,
accomplishments of
yes.
the Native Americans were revolutionary among Homo sapiens.
Yeah,
Think about it like that. So we need to center that history rather than think about it as a lens of French bringing smallpox and what did they learn about, like,
yeah,
the people's stories that they had when they were, their families were decimated.
yeah.
And we center it to the indigenous history, and yeah, and you'll find out that there's a lot of interesting stories to be told. There's a lot of interesting places in North America. Cahokia, if you're driving across the country on I-70, I believe it's I-70, and near St. Louis, go check out Cahokia. Climb up the steps of Monk's Mountain. Learn that it's the biggest indigenous city in North America, north of Mexico. Mountainville in Alabama, Poverty Point in Louisiana, Mesa Verde and Colorado, and the palace there. Imagine all the stories there. We don't have to think about them through colonialism. We can think
No.
about them as, what the heck were they thinking, and like, what were these people doing when they made these elaborate things? Even if we weren't there, we could, and just give a way for people to care about them. You
Yeah.
have to appeal to their emotion. So
Well, cool. Again, is there anything else you want to talk about? Because we've been going for an hour and a half now.
let me think. I don't I I think that's all I kind of wanted to talk about it. The book is on Amazon. It's the audio book on Audible will be out soon. I have a voice actor, Charlie Brogan, I believe his last name is how you say it. He is going to be narrating it, and I just listened to the final version and approved it, so it should be out. So if you don't want to buy Great Water, there's hardback and paperback on Amazon.
I'll
But you
put
can
links down
also,
in the description of the video.
okay, thanks. And you can also do Kindle, and shortly, it's right now it's June 1st, 2024, but within this month, you should be able to download the audiobook as well. So
Cool.
I think with
And
that, that's
it's
yeah.
a short read. It's what, like 100 something pages. It's not
Yeah,
super long.
it's about 200 pages. The audiobook, if you read it continuously through, is 6 hours long, or
Okay,
listen
yeah.
to it continually through. Um, yeah, it's not that long. It's supposed to be easy to read. It's for high schoolers. This is not a technical book. You're going to hear technical knowledge. You'll see how I have some footnotes in there so you can follow the details. But this is not a boring book. This is a book that is supposed to be, you're supposed to like be on an adventure, and you start the book and you're immersed in that world. And then
Hmm.
it peels back to show, how did I get to that story? So by the end, you know the history of why I thought like archaic hunter-gatherers that are in canoes that aren't using any ceramics. If you notice through the book, nobody's using ceramics.
Mm-mm.
Try to imagine a world where there's no plates, no jars. I mean, ceramic jars. You have to put all that together to create this world. There's no agriculture, there's no horses, there's no cows, there's no plates. But so that world you'll be immersed in right away without knowing it, and you'll soon learn how we came to that conclusion, and how it actually is more fantastic than the so-called transatlantic missing copper people.
Yeah.
It's more ridiculous than that. So
And
yeah.
the magic as it's placed in the story is fun too.
Oh, yeah.
I,
I try to have some fun in there, some jokes, a little bit of, I tried to make some, like, stories that are roughly based on indigenous history. So I did want to also apply exactly the mythologies of today, because I'm
Mhm.
not in the place to do that. But
Right.
I used like general outlines of stuff. Like I knew the contact, the birch bark canoes were heavily decorated to
Hmm.
identify the people and where you're from. So like I took those kind of ideas and emplaced them in the archaic.
Yeah.
But you remember, when we're talking about a society 5,000 years ago in the book.
Yeah.
So imagine a 5,000 years ago society in Europe or anywhere else in the world. It's very
Very
hard
different.
yeah, very, very different than what was at contact. So there's a lot of imagination at play. I try to keep it open, but at the same time, hit the things I know were happening, like travel, canoes, rock hammers. I know areas where there are large mines. So it's based in truth. But
There
I
were a few
try not
times
to
reading
touch
it.
too much.
There were a few times reading it where like I would see a statement and I'd be like, I think I know what report he's pulling that detail from or
Okay,
something like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That's the kind of stuff that happened. Like the swan bone flute
Yeah.
is a one report. Turtle shells for drinking shells.
Hmm.
You see that, and I brought that up in the book. But yeah. I hope if you read it that you fall in love with the old copper culture and become passionate about it and tell people about it, and also get excited about the indigenous history of North America. It's fantastic. And I hope you read more about it. All it's really doing is extending our history of the United States. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it like the United States. I mean, the geographic United States didn't begin in 1776. We're a continuation of the cultures that lived in the United States. And so, or the geographic United States.
Yeah.
And so we need to also bring them into our history and write it in a way. I wrote it in a way so that a 21st century American English speaker is reading 21st century American English.
Yeah.
You're not reading. I didn't want to be like the Native Americans are speaking in like some kind of like weird dialect or something that I'm
Yeah.
like making up. And also I took the 19th century writers, which their papers are so hard to read and honestly a little offensive, and I
Yeah.
smoothed them way out.
Yeah.
I was like, well, we don't have to say that. We can say, I know what they're trying to say here. And also, they're just so hard to read. So, a couple chapters in there are just more or less turning old reports into modern English.
Yeah.
You could see what they were saying, which was essentially, holy crap, Native Americans are way more advanced than we thought. There's huge mines up here. We have no idea who made them, and we're using them to find copper mines for
Yeah.
us, for our industry. And that's what they were writing back to like the Smithsonian.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they were trying to convey the same thing we're trying to convey was, but they didn't have the stories. They were like, they might have been the Aztecs or the Egyptians, I think in
Yeah.
Gilman. He's like, oh, or the Peruvian mound builders. And it was like, what? But at the time, that's all Gilman would have known. The Egyptians, he would have known about maybe the Aztecs at that point from Mexico. He would have had no stories telling him
Yeah.
about the old copper culture. He was just totally shooting from the hip.
Yeah.
And so,
They
and
did
on
not
top of
have the
that,
imagination to consider that, like, in the same way that there was a time that people had a hard time believing that Native Americans were smart enough to make big piles of dirt. Uh, the like, how much more incredulous would they have been to think that they had an extensive copper mining industry without farming? I mean,
yeah,
it is beyond the what they thought was possible in the world.
yes, yes, yes. So, and I hope that the reader then empathizes with that. So when you have your crazy uncle or the guy at the bar who's telling you about the Vikings, now you know this is how we got to that point. All
Yeah.
these stories and cartoons and Hollywood and radio shows have contaminated people's minds. And if you read Great Water and you watch this podcast, you now are armed with the empathy to know why they're like that. And you can also disarm them by saying you should order Great Water from the Lost Mines Lake Superior on Amazon. And I will be eternally grateful.
Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it. Thank you for, giving up some time on your Saturday, and I'll try to have this edited, I'm going to actually dig at Spyro next week, so I'm going to be
Oh,
busy, but
whoa.
yeah,
Another great Mississippian culture site,
yep.
right? In Oklahoma.
I'm going to, they're doing a field school and I'm just going to help out. The one of the things we've got an issue with is people in like the archaeological industry not really having good relationships with people in the like in academia, specifically like students. We don't interface with students very well, and
Hmm.
I like to at least be able to like work with students occasionally and let them know, here's some good companies to work for when you
Yeah,
graduate. Here's some
yes.
things to just like be able to have those conversations and facilitate those uh like
Connections or
yeah,
relationships.
exactly, yeah.
And that's something I appreciate about, like, we are now recently been Instagram friends.
Mhm.
And I do appreciate that about you, how you're trying to convey the industry side of archaeology better, because there is a decent amount of employment, pretty good employment in industrial, or would you call it industrial? What's the word for it?
In Europe they call it commercial archaeology. We call it
Commercial,
cultural resource
cultural
management.
resource management. And I
Yeah.
do know a few folks in that, and it's a field you can get into. It's pretty ridiculous. You do get sent to some crazy sites, and not everybody can be in academia. I can tell you firsthand on PhD how hard it is to make it through. And if you're going to do it, you better be, it's like getting married. You're
Yeah.
going to be, it's a lifestyle. If you
Yeah.
don't do it for the paycheck, you hope one day you get a paycheck. That's good. But there is so much room out in this world for people with master's and bachelor's degrees in geology and archaeology, doing natural resource management and working in other fields related to that, like in the park services, and that are doing important work preserving this history. And they just, and when I teach my undergrad classes, when I teach about geology, I do like an intro to geology class. The first day I talk about careers in geology, because all the people in there, I'm like, what does a geologist do? They go, diamonds, oil. They don't even know.
Yeah.
And their parents are not going to probably know unless they're geologists. So when you say, hey, these are things you can actually do with it, all of a sudden they're like, oh, it's relevant to me now.
Yeah.
And so that's what I appreciate about you, pushing that with your platform and doing your thing like you're doing it in Oklahoma. So thank you. And I hope
Appreciate that.
this
That
all
means a lot.
I hope you keep going, and hope we get to meet one day in person, maybe at a meeting.
some conference somewhere.
some conference somewhere, and we can nerd out more.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I will tell you, have a good, I guess, rest of your morning for you.
Yep. I will do. And
See you
thank you
around.
for having me on.
Yeah.
Bye.